And once again, we are privileged to have with us as our presenter, Dr. Stephen Staggs. Stephen holds a PhD and a graduate certificate in ethnohistory from Western Michigan University. He is a historian of colonial North America, author of Calvinists and Indians in the Northeastern Woodlands, and his research focuses on the interactions between indigenous African and European peoples in early modern Europe, colonial North America, and the Atlantic world. So let's give another warm welcome to Dr. Steve Staggs.
Thank you, Steve. It's a real treat to be with you again. It's a little bittersweet because I'm so excited to be here, but I'm a bit sad this is our last session together because I really enjoy being with you and learning with you. If you think of the last two sessions focused on Kapitein as our character, and then our last one, and then the second session focusing on Bosman, Willem Bosman, the last one focusing on Kapitein. And if you ask me which is the figure or character at the heart of this presentation, I would choose John Henry Livingston, although you'll hear a lot about his family, and you won't hear much about him till the very end, but you'll see why I think he's an important character, someone I'm exploring even more as I continue doing research. You may recognize some people on this slide. Mae West, Sid Luckman, if you're a Bears fan, you'll know who he is. Neil Diamond and Barbara Streisand are just a few of the famous alumni who have attended Erasmus Hall, a public high school located in the Flatbush neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. Founded in 1786, Erasmus Hall was originally established as a private academy. Named after the Renaissance scholar Erasmus of Rotterdam, Erasmus Hall Academy was the first secondary school granted a charter by the 21 members of the Board of Regents, appointed to provide oversight to the colleges and academies incorporated in the state of New York after 1784. Almost half of whom, as you can see on this slide, were prominent Dutch Americans. Everyone in orange were prominent Dutch Americans and members of the Dutch Reformed Church. In fact, you'll see a dominee sat on the Board of Regents about 3/4 of the way down. Dominee Dirk Romein sat on that Board of Regents. And they were the ones who granted a charter to Erasmus Hall Academy, the first secondary school granted such a charter in the state of New York. However, if you visit the original Academy building, which still stands, by the way, I took that photograph, or read about its history today, you will not hear about the racism that was poured into its foundations. It has been hidden beneath its whitewashed clapboards. This whitewashing of the past brings us back to the object of this course, of these 4 sessions, and of this project, which is this: to uncover how ideologies of race influence the ways in which early modern Calvinists of both African and European descent interpreted their Bibles, organized institutions, and participated in the broader societies of the early modern Dutch Atlantic world. Now, you'll recall in the second session, I analyzed the ways in which Willem Bosman, a Calvinist merchant in the service of the Dutch West India Company, shifted the concept of race from one based on religious criteria to one based on biological criteria. in 1704. In our last session, I showed how Jacobus Kapitein, the first person of African descent ordained as a minister in an orthodox Protestant denomination, challenged the enslavement of Africans in 1742. Now in this, the fourth and final session, I will trace the network of ordained and lay members of the Dutch Reformed Church who accepted and adopted the more rigid biological constructions of race being articulated by Dutch, English, and Euro-American philosophers in the 18th century. By doing so, they justified their enslavement of Black people and the wealth and power it generated, which ultimately enabled the DRC, the Dutch Reformed Church, and many of its members to wield outside power and influence at the local, state, and federal level, and thus contributed to the codification of racism in the Republic. And by the way, I am deliberately saying Republic there to refer both to the Dutch Republic and to the early Republic and Republic that is the United States. So two republics. And that what is my working thesis, what I just heard. My intent is that all of these sessions, as you've listened to them, show that is the case. Now, to uncover the white supremacy embedded in the foundations of Erasmus Hall, it is useful to dig into the roots of the Dutch community of Midwoud. In the 1640s, the leading inhabitants of New Amsterdam, which you can see I've pointed to it on that map, began dividing the western half of Long Island into farms and farming communities. Nowadays, we don't think of western half of Long Island as farming. We think of Brooklyn, right? But in the 1640s, the inhabitants of New Amsterdam were dividing up the western half of what they called, as you can see on the map, I've written it up, Het Lange Eiland. That's where Long Island gets its name after. The Dutch called it Lange Eiland because it's a long island. However, in the middle of that part of Lange Eiland, and again, I've pointed to it, was what the Dutch called a vlakkenbos, a wooded plain that was difficult to clear. Around 1650, families from Groningen, and I pointed to where that village is located. Around 1650, families from Groningen in the Dutch Republic. By the way, Groningen was a village in an impoverished county in the Dutch Republic at the time. The province of Drenthe was an impoverished province at the time. So in the 1650, families from Groningen, many of them poor, left the Dutch Republic and they sailed across the North Atlantic. And when these families from Groningen arrived in New Nederland, guess what they began to do? They set out to clear the vlakkenbos. And by 1652, they had established a village in what was the vlakkenbos that they had cleared, and they called their village Midwoud. 10 years after the founding of the village of Midwoud, which was founded in 1652, 62 more immigrants from the southwest corner of Drenthe arrived in New Nederland, and most of them settled in Midwoud. where those families from Brownen had settled. Following the English takeover of New Nederland in 1664, the village was renamed Flatbush. Now, the administration of Midwoud mirrored the administration of villages in the Dutch Republic, where there was an overlap in religious and secular administration. They overlapped in the Dutch Republic, and the village administration of Midwoud mirrored that. And that overlap of religious and secular administration continued well after the English takeover in 1664. In fact, here's the proof. Half the people in the town's administration were at one time or another also members of the consistory of the Flatbush Dutch Reformed Church. Overlap of religious and secular administration. Consistory members are also happen to be local administrators of the village. Religious, secular overlap of administration that mirrored what was going on in villages in the Dutch Republic. That was happening here in New Nederland, now called New York after the English takeover. By the way, when the English took over, that didn't mean all the Dutch people left. They stayed. 4 years later, in 1668, so 4 years after the English takeover, Flatbush was declared the seat or administrative center of what would become, as you can see on this map, Kings County. Now, Kings County was a predominantly Dutch agricultural county with the highest concentration of enslaved Africans in the North. The highest. As you can see from this slide, now this I took a photograph when I was working in, if you recall from the first session, working in the Brooklyn Historical Society, I came across this list of slaves and owners in 1755. And as you can see on the slide, enslaved Black labor was central to the day-to-day survival and economic life of these Dutch Reformed Americans. In fact, look at upper left, I've translated for you from the Dutch, owners' names, and look who's the first name on the list. A domine, a reverend, Reverend van Sinderen. And then you go to the right, who does Domine van Sinderen claim as property? Then on the right, you have female names. Those are the enslaved African women. Domine van Sinderen and Captain Peter Stryker, Domine van Sinderen claims Isabel as property. Peter Stryker claims Zijne as his property. In fact, by 1698, over 40% of the households in Flatbush included in Kings County, included enslaved people from sub-Saharan Africa and the West Indies, over 40% by 1698. By 1703, there were 343 enslaved Blacks in Kings County. 207 of them were male. By 1790, over 61% of the families in Kings County claimed Black people as property. Now let's put that number in some perspective. As you can see from this table, this meant that the only counties in South Carolina with a higher percentage of families claiming Black people as property were Beaufort and Charleston. As slavery became the core legal, economic, and social system in colonial New York, the rights of free blacks were eroded while the number of enslaved Africans steadily grew. This, for me, is an arresting image. This is a detail from William Burgess's Great View of New York, circa 1719. In the background, I'm pointing out the spire of the Dutch Reformed Church on Garden Street. And look what happens if you walk from that church a few blocks away on the East River. What do you find? A notorious open slave market. There's a little, if you go to New York today, there is a little plaque showing the spot where that market existed. As we go on, you'll see why, to me, that's an arresting image. John Henry Livingston will be the domine of the Dutch Reformed Church in New York City. As laws increased restrictions on Black liberties, so did Black resistance. As laws increased restrictions on Black liberties, so did Black resistance. During the night of April 1, 1712, for example, some enslaved Blacks killed 9 inhabitants of New York City, including the prominent Dutch-American merchant and landowner Adriaan Hooglands, who was also a member of the Collegiate Dutch Reformed Church, which you can see on this slide. The local authorities quickly convened special courts, which ultimately resulted in the conviction and execution of 18 Blacks through a variety of tortures. That's quoting from the source. Clearly, the enslaved were a serious problem to Euro-American enslavers. The enslaved, you see, threatened their own self-representation as Christian entrepreneurs. Christian entrepreneurs. The enslaved threatened their self-representation as Christian entrepreneurs. African captives were neither willing to work as slaves or accept their status as slaves. So to give enslavers the maximum amount of control over Black bodies, corporal punishment was legitimized under colonial law. The legal system also maintained and supported the status of enslavement, which required the tacit and active support of the church, the state, and its citizens. In fact, later that year, the New York Assembly responded by passing a more restrictive Black code. The new Negro Act, as it was called, reiterated sanctions against entertaining, trading with, or selling liquor to slaves. By the way, notice Negro Act, again, the equation that Bosman had given of slavery and Blackness. Negro Act. It also gave enslavers permission to privately correct the people they claimed as property, except in capital offenses. The Negro Act also forbade free Blacks from selling liquor to the enslaved and ordered that, quote, no Negro, Indian, or mulatto that hereafter be made free shall enjoy, this is very important in there, shall enjoy, hold, or possess any houses, lands, tenements, or hereditaments in this colony, end quote. Finally, the Negro Act stated, quote, since it is found by experience that the free Negroes of this colony are an idle, slothful people, and prove very often a charge on the place where they are, any European wishing to free a person they enslaved must first post a 60-pound surety and provide 20 pounds annually to ensure the former slave's maintenance. You see what these white assemblymen were doing in this act, don't you? They were defining blacks as slaves. They were blocking blacks from the path to freedom and liberty. And they were clearly echoing the racism articulated by Willem Bosman in one of the most popular travelogues ever written, de nauwkeurige beschrijving van de Ghanese goud, tand en slaafkoest, his accurate description of the Ghanaian gold, ivory, and slave coast. But I think it is also worth noting that more than half of the New York Assemblymen in 1712 were influential Dutch Americans who were also members of the Dutch Reformed Church. Again, everyone in orange. Prominent Dutch Americans and members of the Dutch Reformed Church who wrote and passed that law, the Negro Act. In addition, two of the most powerful among them married into elite Dutch Reform slaveholding families. William Nicol and Robert Livingston the Elder. Now, Nicol married Anna van Rensselaer. Anna was the widow of the first Lord of Rensselaerswijk Manor, Kiliaan van Rensselaer. And Anna was the daughter of Jeremias and Maria van Rensselaer. Anna's extended family included two prominent uncles, Stephanus and Jacobus van Kortlandt. As you can see on the slide, her uncle Jacobus van Kortlandt also served in the New York Assembly that passed the more restrictive Black Code in 1712. A New York City merchant and two-time mayor to boot, mayor of New York City that is, Jacobus van Kortlandt made his generational wealth in the transatlantic slave trade. He then used his fortune to purchase a 1,000-acre plantation in Yonkers in Westchester County. If you go there today, there's a big iron sign. It is now Van Kortlandt Park. Part of that plantation is now a park with the family name on it. With the fortune he made in the transatlantic slave trade, he purchased a 1,000-acre plantation in Yonkers in Westchester County. He also purchased people to maintain the property. According to a 1698 census, 9 enslaved Africans lived and worked on the land. Their names were listed as, quote, Hetter, Toon, Mars, Hester, and Toon the Neger, and Diana, his wife, and 3 children, Ben, Abraham, and Jacob, end quote. In 1733, Jacobus placed an advertisement in the New York Gazette. As you can see, here it is. Here's the advertisement. Andrew Saxton, one of the black men Jacobus claimed as property, had run away on August 18. A month later, Andrew still hadn't returned. In the ad, as you can see, Jacobus begrudgingly acknowledged Andrew's agency. Andrew, the ad began, quote, ran away, end quote. Again, the problem, enslaved Africans are resisting their status as enslaved people. And he begrudgingly, Jacobus does, acknowledge his agency. He, quote, ran away, end quote. Jacobus then immediately, as you see in the ad, immediately turned to biological racial markers, doesn't he? Describing Andrew as, quote, a tall, lusty fellow who is very black, end quote. A skilled cooper and carpenter. Jacobus, Andrew was, by the way, Andrew, the enslaved man, was a skilled cooper and carpenter. So Jacobus offered a very generous reward to anyone who secured the, quote, said Negro man, so that he might be had again, end quote. 6 years after placing his advertisement, Jacobus, by the way, there are many, many of these kinds of ads in New York Gazette and other New York newspapers. This is just one of many. 6 years after placing his advertisement, Jacobus died. In his will, he listed the following enslaved people: Pompey, which he described as my Indian slave; Piero, John, and Frank, each of whom he identified as, quote, my Negro man slave; Hester and Hannah, each of whom he identified as, quote, my Negro women, as well as unnamed, uncounted children who are identified as the existing children of Hannah, quote, together with all their children that already are or hereafter shall be born of the body of the said Negro woman Hester, except such as the said children as I may think fit in my lifetime to dispose of by deed of gift or otherwise, end quote. In other words, I could, if I choose, if Esther bears children, I can choose to sell them off. That's up to me. Jacobus's only son, Frederick, inherited the plantation in Yonkers and one or more of the enslaved. By 1748, Frederick and his wife, along with their 5 children and 11 enslaved people, were living in this home that was built on the plantation. The enslaved, who were quartered in a cramped, unheated garret room in the north attic, included Caesar, a Native American man, and his wife, Kate; Piero, the miller; his wife, Hester, and their little boy, Peter; Lavelie, the boatman; Mary; 2 girls named Hannah and Sarah; and 2 boys, Klaus and little Frankie. By the way, that was quite common for the enslaved of Dutch Americans and to be quartered in the garret of an attic. That was their cramped living quarters. They're all garreted in there, away, literally away up in the attic. The Van Cortlandt family was certainly not the only elite Dutch Reformed family. Remember, the Van Cortlandts I just described, they were members of the Dutch Reformed Church. The Van Cortlandt family was certainly not the only elite Dutch Reformed family who built generational wealth by making slaveholding a key part of their strategy for business growth and shoring up their power through strategic marriages, as you can see on this slide. During the 16th and 17th century, elite Dutch families maintained strong connections to Curaçao, the hub of the transatlantic slave trade. Their networks expanded in the Chesapeake region of the time, which is now modern-day states of Maryland, Virginia, the Chesapeake. Their networks extended to Curaçao, to the Chesapeake. In fact, the Stuyvesant Bayard families were one of several families who formed the first generation of elite Dutch families who emigrated to New Nederland. These families laid the foundation for subsequent slaveholding generations in New Nederland, the Caribbean, and the southern colonies of British America. The Van Horn Livingston families intermarried as well, expanding the 18th century cohort. The Van Horn Livingston branches extended into New England, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, profoundly shaping the legal, political, religious, and social history of what would become the United States of America. These white Anglo-Dutch families formed a northern gentry who created a society built on the backs of enslaved people of color. In the United States, in our minds, typically if we think of a gentry, oh, that's in the South. There was a northern gentry of elite Dutch Reformed families who had outside power and influence. And that society they were creating was built on the back of enslaved Black people that they claimed as property. Like so many other English and Scottish dissidents, including, by the way, the Staggs family, I traced my ancestry back to Norwich and East Anglia, and my ancestors in the 1600s in that area were Puritans who went to Leiden. Like so many other English and Scottish dissidents, the family of the exiled Presbyterian minister John Livingston settled in the Dutch Republic. So many English and Scottish dissidents did that. The Pilgrims did that. Went to Leiden first, went to the Dutch Republic. Over time, John's son Robert became fluent in the Dutch language and Dutch culture, which would prove really useful. After his father died, Robert left the Dutch Republic and emigrated to North America, eventually settling in Albany, New York. In less than a year, Robert secured work as secretary to Nicholas van Rensselaer, the pastor of the Dutch Reformed Church of Albany and the director of Rensselaerswijk Manor. At age 39, Nicholas had married the 19-year-old daughter of Philip Pieterse Schuyler, Alida. Along with the Van Cortlandt and Van Rensselaer families, the Schuylers were also one of the most prominent Dutch Reformed slaveholding families in New York. A year after Reverend Nicholas van Rensselaer died, Robert married Alida Schuyler van Rensselaer. Working in concert with his brother-in-law, Peter, Robert convinced the governor of New York to grant Albany a municipal charter like the one awarded to New York City a few months earlier. Robert was then appointed clerk of the city and County of Albany. Robert also served as the Secretary of Indian Affairs, and he served on the New York Provincial Assembly. Back to that slide, where he voted to pass the Black Code of 1712. Robert's support of a more restrictive Black Code is not surprising. Robert amassed one of the largest fortunes in 17th century New York through his investments in the transatlantic slave trade, purchasing a half interest in the Marguerite, a ship that traveled to Madagascar, Barbados, and Virginia to trade in slaves and sugar and tobacco. Some of the enslaved worked on Robert's 160,000 acre manor, granted to him by a royal charter in 1715. That same year, Ben, a Black man, killed Johannes Dijkman, a tenant on the Livingston Manor, who claimed Ben as property. Although many feared that it might be part of another slave revolt, Robert Livingston and other county magistrates concluded that the murder was an act of a vengeful father. You see, Johannes Dijkman had sold Ben's daughter to one of Robert Livingston's relatives down in New York City, far from the manor, far from her father. When he died in 1728, Robert bequeathed the bulk of his 160,000 acre estate to his son Philip, who also inherited 6 of the 12 Black people Robert claimed as property. Baptized in the Dutch Reformed Church of Albany, Philip learned to read and write in both English and Dutch from his mother, Alida. In 1707, at the age of 21, Philip began serving as his father's unofficial deputy in the offices of the clerk of the city and county of Albany. The following year, Philip married Catherine von Brugge, the only child of the Dutch-American aristocrats Peter von Brugge and Sarah Kuyler. After their marriage in the Dutch Reformed Church, Philip and Catherine took up residence in the Livingston townhouse in Albany. 3 months after they married, the first of their 7 children was baptized in the Dutch Reformed Church of Albany. Now, unlike his father, Philip considered himself a merchant first and foremost. When he did participate in politics, Philip primarily did so to make a profit, just like his father. When his father resigned his position as secretary to the Commission of Indian Affairs, Philip used it to his advantage, acquiring thousands of acres of ancestral Kanyen'kehá:ka Mohawk homelands in and around the Tianantatsi Mohawk River Valley. Philip and his sons also inherited the family business. During the 1730s and 40s, Philip was the leading importer of enslaved Africans from Jamaica and Antigua. He was part owner of several slave ships, some of which were owned in partnership with his sons. In August 1733, one of Philip's ships, the Catherine, carried 50 enslaved Black people from Jamaica. The 50 Africans were then either sold in one of the taverns or grog houses along the wharves of New York City, or at a designated market, such as the notorious open air market along the East River at the end of Wall Street, which you can see on this slide. You can see this slave auction in progress, actually, in that illustration. Philip and his sons were also among the first New Yorkers who imported enslaved people from Africa before the abolition of the contract that had given Britain the exclusive rights to provide enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies in the Americas. And there's a copy of that contract. In 1738, Philip bought a 1/3 share in a voyage to the coast of Guinea in West Africa, where 200 Africans were purchased. Philip then consigned the enslaved Africans to his son, Peter von Buch Livingston, who was Philip's partner in Jamaica. Despite an alleged plot by enslaved Africans and poor whites to burn New York City to the ground 3 years later, slave ships continued to arrive along the wharves of New York City. When the Wolf, one of the 4 African slavers in which Philip Livingston and his sons invested, docked in the New York harbor in 1751, only 66 of the 147 people had survived the transatlantic crossing, despite Dutch cleanliness and humane conditions on board Dutch ships. That's a little bit sad, tongue-in-cheek there. When describing one of these voyages in a letter to the Dutch Reformed merchant on the Livingston Manor, Petrus de Wit, Philip's son Robert thanked God that, so here's a copy of the letter from Robert Livingston to Petrus de Wit. Now, Petrus de Wit was a Dutch Reformed merchant on Livingston Manor. And Philip's son Robert is writing him a letter. And in the letter, he thanked God that, quote, remember, he's describing one of these voyages, these transatlantic voyages to the Dutch Reformed merchant on Livingston Manor, Petrus de Wit. And in the letter, Philip's son Robert thanked God that, quote, we have had the good fortune of having one of our Guinea sloops come in, though after a long passage of 79 days, in which time they buried 37 slaves, buried meaning threw them overboard, and since 3 more and 2 more likely to die, which is an accident not to be helped, and which, if it had not happened, as we should have made a golden voyage, but as it is, there will not be much left, I fear, unless the other sloop ship meets with better luck, end quote. Now, the ship in question was the Rhode Island, one of the 4 African slavers owned by Philip Livingston and Sons, by the Livingston family. Over the course of 4 months on the Guinea coast, the captain of the Rhode Island acquired 120 men, women, and children. Having buried 12 girls, 6 women, 17 boys, and 3 men at sea, the captain of the Rhode Island lost 32% of the captured people aboard the ship. According to the historian Philip Misevich, such a loss was extremely high and was likely, therefore, a financial disaster for the Livingston family. Robert Livingston's callous description reflected the family's emphasis on the financial rather than the human cost involved. Now, at the height of his involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, Philip gave a generous donation to Yale College to acknowledge his gratitude for the education his sons received there. Yale used the funds to establish the Livingstonian Professorship of Divinity, the first endowed professorship at Yale. In addition to naming the professorship after Livingston, they also named, as you can see in the right there from the photograph, they also named a prominent gateway at Yale in his honor. You can see his name there inscribed in stone. When Philip died in New York City in 1749, his body was transported up the Hudson and interned in the Livingston Memorial Church and Burial Ground, a historic Dutch Reformed church you can visit to this day. In the end, the funeral cost 500 pounds sterling, which was a considerable sum in those days. Yet this sort of funeral cost was typical of the extravagance prevalent among the Northern gentry. After graduating from Yale in 1737, Philip's son, Philip, returned to Albany, where he was able to secure clerkships in the municipal government, thanks to his father's power and influence. 3 years later, Philip married Katharina ten Broek, who came from one of the oldest and most prominent Dutch Reformed families in Albany. After their marriage, Philip and Christina moved to New York City, so Philip could pursue a career in the import business, just like his father. Here they purchased a stone townhouse and a 40-acre estate in Brooklyn. Philip speculated heavily in real estate and the slave trade, financing at least 15 slave trading voyages that transported hundreds of enslaved Africans to New York. Several of them worked on his estate in Brooklyn, one of whom ran away in November 1752. We know this because Philip published advertisements in several New York City newspapers, offering a reward for his capture. Unlike his father, Philip Livingston Jr. considered himself just as much a politician as a businessman. He was a New York City alderman in the 1750s, and subsequently a member of the New York General Assembly for almost a decade, before serving as Speaker of the Assembly in 1768. Now, when the members of the British Parliament imposed a direct tax on the British colonies in America to pay for the British troops stationed in the colonies at the conclusion of the French and Indian War, Philip attended the Stamp Act Congress that was held in New York City's City Hall in October of 1765. City Hall is that large building right in the center. That's where the Stamp Act Congress was held in October of 1765. Philip Livingston Jr. attended that Congress. After the United States gained its independence in 1783, City Hall was renamed Federal Hall. You may have been wondering why the label on the slide. It got renamed Federal Hall. Why? Because it served as the nation's capital. That was the capital of the United States until 1790. It also hosted the first Congress. It was held in there, in that hall, not in Washington, D.C., in New York City, and it was where George Washington was sworn in as the first president of the United States of America. Now, as you can see on this slide, just around the corner from Federal Hall, less than 2 blocks, stood the Middle Collegiate Dutch Reformed Church. You can see the spire in the background. So you just go around the corner 2 blocks away, you're at the entrance to the Middle Collegiate Dutch Reformed Church. And there is Congressional Building 2 blocks away, federal power. As elder and deacon in the Dutch Reformed Church of New York City, Philip Livingston Jr., Philip only had to round the corner at Nassau to get to the Livingston's Sugar House, as you can see on this slide. So there's the church. He was an elder and deacon in the church, and he only had to round the corner at Nassau to get to the Livingston Sugar House, which was located on Liberty Street. Now, why am I mentioning the Sugar House? The Sugar House was built in 1754, and it is where the Livingston family stored and refined the sugar they imported from Jamaica in their warehouse. They weren't the only ones. Elite Dutch Reformed slaveholding families, such as the Bayards, the Cowlers, the Roosevelts, and the Van Cortlandts, built similar warehouses in New York City. They were all slaveholding families. And it is here in these sugar warehouses that these elite Dutch Reformed families stored and refined the sugar and molasses they imported from Jamaica and St. Eustatius. St. Eustatius, which is still part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, by the way, was a Dutch Caribbean island, and was one of the most profitable assets of the Dutch West India Company. And it was a transit point for enslaved Africans in the transatlantic slave trade. Now, given his investments in the transatlantic slave trade, it is not surprising, is it, that Philip was a fierce opponent of the new regulations and taxes imposed by the British Parliament, including the Sugar Act that was passed in 1764. Now, the purpose of the Sugar Act was to raise revenue by retaining the high tariff or duty on sugar and prohibiting the importation of all foreign rum. In 1770, 4 years after Parliament repealed the Sugar Act, Philip filed an account as executor of George Parley, the deceased owner of the Friendship Estate in Jamaica. 2 years later, the sugar, rum, and enslaved Africans who labored on the Friendship Estate came into the hands of Philip Livingston Jr. Although Philip never called it home, Philip did send his sons to learn the sugar business, oversee the family's plantation in Jamaica, and find new opportunities to increase their mammon line, their bottom line. And so 10 years after Philip signed the Declaration of Independence, you'll find his signature. Philip Livingston is on the Declaration of Independence. He signed it. 10 years after Philip signed the Declaration of Independence, Philip's son, Philip, acquired the sugar, rum, cattle, and enslaved Africans on another Jamaican plantation. They called it the Albany Estate. You can see that here's the map of Jamaica. And I put dots where their 2 plantations, Livingston plantations, were in Jamaica. When Philip's son, Philip Henry, provided the number of enslaved people on the Albany Estate in the March quarter of 1815, he claimed 215 people as property. When Philip died in 1787, he passed the friendship estate on to his son, Philip, and his son-in-law, John Henry Livingston. John Henry Livingston was the domine of the Collegiate Dutch Reformed Church in New York City. The following year, Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the States of Virginia was published in Philadelphia. As New Yorkers consumed Jefferson's notes, some, quote, pious and well-informed Negro men, end quote, were requesting membership in full communion in the Flatbush Dutch Reformed Church. However, according to the pastor of Flatbush, Reverend Peter Lowe, their request was met with a, quote, singular kind of opposition, end quote. In October 1788, the General Synod, the highest authority for the Dutch Reformed churches in North America, met in New York City under the leadership of Reverend Peter Lowe's mentor, Reverend John Henry Livingston, who at the time, and I discovered this through the census, and I've not seen anyone cite this or mention this. At the time, Domine John Henry Livingston claimed 3 Black people as property. During the meetings, the Synod passed its first resolution on the subject of, quote, the reception of slaves as members of the church, end quote. Ultimately, the Synod determined that, now I'm quoting from the Synod's notes. Ultimately, the Synod of October 1788 determined that, quote, overseers of congregations, the council, should exercise all proper prudence by receiving the testimony of masters and mistresses. That's another way of saying the enslavers, the people who claim Black people as property. You should receive their testimony in relation to the subject of membership. And likewise, by attending to everything which may subserve the promotion and establishment of peace of the household, end quote. In short, the Synod left the decision up to the leaders of each congregation, most of whom I've discovered in my research, because I've been doing some tedious research on who were members of these churches and who were the leaders of these Dutch Reformed churches. Most of the leaders claimed Black people as property at the time. So the very next month, and now if you want to know what those leaders thought, you're about to learn. If you haven't heard this before. The very next month, Reverend Peter Lowe, so now we're in November, a month after Synod made that determination on the subject of membership of Black people in the Dutch Reformed Church. The very next month, Peter Lowe, Reverend Peter Lowe, the pastor of Flatbush, and again, I've never seen anyone cite this either, who at the time claimed 2 Black people as property himself, wrote a letter outlining some of the objections expressed by those who were opposed to the admission of the, quote, worthy Black men who wanted to join the Flatbush congregation. The objections of the leaders in the Flatbush congregation, most of whom claimed Black people as property themselves, reiterated the biological racist view of Africans expressed by Willem Bosman and Thomas Jefferson. Quote, Negroes, the Dutch Reformed supremacists asserted, have no souls. They are, the white supremacists continued, accursed of God. They are a species very different from us. Witness their nauseous sweat, complexion, and manners. I would be ashamed to commune with them. If these should be admitted, who have now applied, the whole community of Blacks will flock to. And what a terrible congregation we will have. I am afraid of the conduct of the Blacks. Their pretended zeal is nothing else than vain parade and ostentation. If many Negroes be admitted, I tremble for the ark. Adieu, order and harmony in the Dutch church. Negroes will at length summon their masters before the consistory, nay, will constitute a consistory themselves. What an awful sight. Negro elders, deacons, and church masters. They will intermix with white people at the Lord's table to their great offense. End quote. In the end, I would submit not surprisingly, the Flatbush consistory members denied the pious Black men membership in the church. And one wonders why Sundays are so segregated. Meanwhile, the influential domine of Collegiate, the Dutch Reformed Church in New York City, John Henry Livingston, was spending the summer in Flatbush with his theology students. During the summer of 1786, Livingston and John Vanderbilt, a New York State senator and a member of the Flatbush congregation, convinced the prominent families in and around Flatbush to support the establishment of an institution of higher learning in their village. Soon, 40 male heads of households signed and circulated a subscription paper. The signatories, who pledged in total a sum of 915 pounds, counted men of means and power in the early republic and the state of New York. They included the United States Secretary of State, John Jay, you can see in the bottom right of the slide. They included U.S. Senator and Dutch Reformed member of the Dutch Reformed Church, Peter Leyferts. They included Governor George Clinton, New York State Attorney General Aaron Burr, and New York State Assemblyman Alexander Hamilton, who, as you know, married into the Schuyler family, the elite Dutch Reformed family in Albany. In the end, the largest pledges came from three of the most prominent members of the Flatbush congregation, John van der Bilt, Peter Leyferts, and Johannes Lot, who donated 100, 60, and 50 pounds respectively. Not coincidentally, these men were also three of the largest enslavers in Kings County. All three members of the Dutch Reformed Church of Flatbush. Among the three men, they held 38 blacks in bondage in 1790, reflecting the fact that their economic wealth, their social status, and their political power rested on claiming Black people as property. As you can see from this slide, slavery in North 1790, you got to go down to that little corner, see that really crimson color, highest concentration of enslaved Black people, that's Kings County, which is largely Dutch American, Dutch Reformed county, as I mentioned earlier on, in looking at the roots of this county. In 1786 and 1787, they and their fellow members of the Flatbush congregation donated money, timber from their farms, and a plot of land on which to construct the school building. Many even pitched in to construct the 100 by 36-foot structure, including presumably the enslaved Blacks from the surrounding Dutch American plantations. Granted a charter, the 15 members of the Board of Trustees gathered for the first meeting in the newly constructed hall on December 17, 1787. In my mind's eye, they could still smell the freshly cut wood as they gathered on that evening, December 17, 1787. All but one of the trustees who sat down in Erasmus Hall that evening claimed Black people as property. Among them, they enslaved a total of 106 Black people. At least 8 of the trustees, trustee enslavers were members of the Dutch Reformed Church. In fact, 2 of them were pastors in the Dutch Reformed Church, who were also among the 15 members of the Board of Trustees. And these were the men entrusted with the task of shaping the first chartered secondary school in the state of New York. It is from here, by the way, that I go into how they did that, how they shaped that school. And I explored the curriculum, the books that students were taught from, and I highlight the white supremacy in those books. So that's the curriculum. That's what's taught, that biological racism is taught in class. And by the way, the students attending that school came from throughout the Dutch Atlantic world. These were elite white young boys from elite families from throughout the Atlantic world who attended that school. And then that becomes a building block for them then to move into positions of power when their fathers die. To conclude, as this course has shown, both lay members of the Dutch Reformed Church, including governors like Petrus Stuyvesant, merchants such as Willem Bosman, Jacobus van Kortland, and Philip Livingston Jr., and clerical members like Johannes Basiliers in Suriname, John Henry Livingston, and Reverend Peter Lowe, decided to participate. They decided to participate in the highly profitable trade that resulted in African enslavement and death. They justified their participation in the words they left behind. The people who read their words today, and to quote my friend and colleague Angela Sutton, say things like, well, that was just normal then. Or they didn't know any better. Or that was just the way things were. The people who say those things, who include people in my own family, are missing the point. It was not normal then. They did know better. That was the way these men actively created things. If it had ever been normal, moral, and acceptable to profit from the dehumanization of millions of people and to steal their labor, to steal their personhood, and that of their descendants in perpetuity, Dutch Reformed enslavers would not have written countless pages to justify their service of God and mammon. By accepting and adopting the more rigid biological constructions of race, the members of the Dutch Reformed Church justified their enslavement of Black people and the wealth it generated, which ultimately enabled the Dutch Reformed Church and its members to wield outsized power and influence, and thus contribute to the codification of racism in the Dutch Atlantic world. Thank you.
Questions?
I am one of probably several in this classroom that were hoping that we would learn about the earliest Dutch Reformed Church Black pastors. Is that something that you might be developing in the future? I mean, this is all foundational to some of that. Is that coming along that you might be able to tell us some of the maybe more positive aspects of this history? Or is that not in your scope right now?
It's not in my scope right now.
Okay.
Though there is an African-American Calvinist who I am working on, who I'm considering adding to as a character in the story, who does become ordained. And here's the connection. This is why when I discovered this, Reverend Peter Lowe invited him to preach at the Flatbush Church. So right now that's a line of inquiry I need to pursue, because I just found that out while I was working on this. Actually, these presentations, I found that out. So he is someone that I'm considering pursuing his story, and because it connects directly to that congregation. So yeah.
Next question is, if you make all of these notes into a publishable book, which publishers are you likely to find hospitable to helping you publish this?
Yeah,
I'm hoping Erdmann's would, and we're going to have a class on Erdmann's in their publishing history later on in this year, this term in HASP.
That-
Erdman's might be a big candidate, but then persuading the right people and getting the right patronage, let's say, to
Yep.
support this is probably in your future.
Yeah, Judy's right. Right now, when I think about it, or like what would be the ideal publisher for me, Erdman's is high on that list of the publishers I'd like to see take this. And I have a good network of people in the work I've done on the project. Members of the Reformed Church of America have been so helpful in helping me do this research. So I'm really hopeful that ultimately Erdman's would be willing to publish it. But yes, you're right. That network's going to be important and that support.
Before I get to you, just not a question, an observation, since this picture is up. John Heavenly Livingston is kind of an icon in the RCA.
Yes,
Only
Absolutely.
because he was, and Linda, maybe you can help me out here. He was the founder of theological education in the Reformed Church in America, which eventually became the first freestanding theological institution in North America, New Brunswick Theological Seminary.
Yes.
So,
which is, by the way, has a really important archives I've worked in, the New Brunswick archives at that seminary.
Amazing body of work. Thank you very much. How does all this level of slavery involvement and in endorsement and reasoning on their part, how does it compare with other parts of our young country at the same time, or our young colonies at the same time?
So something many of you may or may not be aware of is that when historians embark on a research project, one of the tasks that we're trained to do is to read what's been written already by other historians. You need to know the body of work that's already been done. What I've discovered in looking for that body of work, and I addressed this in the first presentation, is that there is such a silence amongst historians to look at this. It really does challenge this notion that we have, again, of comparing North to South. Again, this is slowly changing. There are some really good books that have just been published within the last 2 years from colleagues I know well, who run in the same circles, who are beginning to address this and confront this history and unsilence this past. So to answer that question, it's relatively new. Not many people have written on this subject and connect these dots. When I first started the project and found that letter, my first thing, I'm sure this has been written about before, and that people have investigated this, because I was looking for it and I couldn't find it, which, like I said in the first session, part of me was surprised, but then the other part of me was, well, that's not surprising, because it's a dark history and it's not something that is typically right among groups. You don't celebrate the dark parts of your past. You elevate the good parts of the past and you let that go and you don't investigate. Part of it is as well, this work that I'm doing in looking at, so I've been tracking down membership lists of Dutch Reformed churches in New York and New Jersey, because that's where they were primarily located in this period. And then what I've been looking through is the census, national census data, which is now available online, by the way, which is so helpful. Taking every census from 1790 all the way to 1865. And the reason I'm taking it all the way, well, there wasn't one in 1865 to 1870, is even though New York, for example, passed a law that said in 1799 that we're going to end slavery, it was a gradual abolition. And so I'm intrigued by, all right, so 1827, when everyone is supposed to have freed the people they claimed as property, you would think that over that period, what I was looking for, did people start like, okay, I'm going to start freeing the enslaved people I claim as property? What I'm discovering is that many Dutch Reformed Americans are actually increasing the number of Africans they're enslaving over the period and then of course, when you get to the 1830 census, you're still seeing those Black people they claimed as property are still living on their property, still serving. But in name, they're not. But now you start seeing the names of the Black people they're claiming they claimed as property. And now you're seeing the names. So you get names of the African Americans as well. So again, that's really tedious work though to do. It's time consuming. So at this point, I've got the Flatbush congregation is done. That was the first one I did. Because again, Peter Lowe's letter and all that. I've got the collegiate church almost done in New York City because I want to compare like a rural Flatbush, which again, rural at that time, to a city, what was going on in New York City, how many Dutch Reform members were claiming Black people's property. I'm working on that historic church at Sleepy Hollow along the lower Hudson. I'm still trying to track down the membership list of Albany because I really want that one. Because it's well known that many of these elite Dutch families are slaveholders. I'm curious to find out how many others in that church were also farmers were claiming. I've got the list in Schenectady and I've started on their research there. So I'm trying to do a composite view of how many Dutch Reformed church members claim Black people's property. New Jersey is an interesting case because their gradual abolition went all the way until 1860, until the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865. There's records of New Jersey Dutch Reformed families still claiming Black people as property during the Civil War that had not been freed yet. I've also run across so time, right? How long did it take this because I've run across a defense of slavery presented at the Synod. I'm going to forget the date here. It's in the 1830s sometime at Synod. There was a really laid out, and that's something I want to include as well. So yeah, it's this particular research, there's a big gap in it. There's been a little work done on it, and there's a lot of recent historians who are starting to do research on slavery in New York, New Jersey. Andrea Mosterman, if you're interested in reading more, she's an excellent historian. We were both getting our PhD at the same time. We became friends. She just published a work called Spaces of Enslavement. And it's brilliant. What she did is she used this idea of spaces and to investigate space. And so she went around and took photographs of these garrets and the attics and talks about the ways in which Dutch Americans in the 16 and 1700s. She takes her stories mainly 1600s to about 1720, but she's focuses on the spaces in which Black people were enslaved and how did Dutch Americans go about enslaving Black bodies. Andrea Mosterman. She's from the Netherlands originally. She works at University in New Orleans. Andrea Mosterman, Mosterman, and she was trained by John Thornton, who wrote one of the really groundbreaking works on Africa and Africans in the Atlantic world. In fact, the title itself tells you everything. Africa and Africans in the making of the Atlantic world. He argues, right, there's this concept, it was Europeans who made the Atlantic world. John Thornton argues, no, Africa and Africans made the Atlantic world just as much as Europeans and makes, if not more. And then he lays out his case. He did extensive research in archives in Africa. In particular, he trained Andrea Mosterman. So she's doing really important work on the larger subject of slavery in New York. Craig Wilder is who's done work on Brooklyn. He just presented to the Northern America Foundation his presentation was actually about some of this work I'm doing on Flatbush. But he's written a book about the ways in which Ivy League schools like Yale, like Princeton, were really, their funding and establishment were based on the transatlantic slave trade, and he's exposing that in that book. So he's another author. Yeah.
The letter that had those 7 or 8 points, where
Yeah.
he's arguing, he's really firing himself up, but he didn't send it. So once again, who was he planning to send it to? And it just sounds like protesting too much. This guy is trying to fire himself up to defend slavery and remind himself, what are my best points again? He's meeting opposition and he's being argued with. And when they comment, so, you know, it would be really, we have no way of knowing who he planned to send it to, or whether it was just him thinking out loud or trying to rally his points.
Yeah.
But the more they do that, the more you know what's really going on.
Yeah.
It seems to me that there would have been a growing population of people who didn't live in New York City. They were beginning to be farther up the Hudson, and they were more ordinary people. There's no way they owned slaves. We know that New York's population was New York's percentage statewide of slaves was going down after 1750 overall, even though you're saying that some of these families were ramping it up. But overall in New York, watch out, because this is a democracy, which is what we need in order to get rid of it. It's becoming a little bit more of a democracy. And there are people in the Reformed Church who are literate, and they can sling the Bible around as well as anybody else. And they're coming after you. And a lot of them are Methodists. And so, yeah, you don't like to be around Black people, but you don't have a very good argument for keeping them out of the church. Now, my understanding was that when John Henry Livingston wrote the Constitution for the Reformed Church in America in the late 1700s, ending a whole century of debate about whether they should stay with Amsterdam or split off and be free, he did say that slaves who have been admitted to church membership do possess all rights of membership, to be buried, to marry, to be elected to office, because all of these things were under contest in the congregation because people in the pews were saying, I know they're rich, I know they run everything, but I don't like the way they drag their slaves around, or I don't like that. They were developing resistance. So this is a fascinating story, and you have a tiger by the tail. When you look at those houses, you should look at the basements as well, because the house that I lived in New Jersey, that was built in 1795, when slavery was still legal, and contained a post office where somebody's got to work. And so the attic is absolutely amazing. Not that it's glorious, but it is adequate for a kind of rafter. It has enough space, but the cellar is also very beautiful and had a wooden floor, beautiful stones. It looks like a European wine cellar. So the slaves may have been in the attic, which is naturally warm in winter, and the basement, which is normally cool in summer, with its own entry and some windows for a little bit of light. So you see, we saw the possibility that there were slaves in that house, or Black people who've been freed, but they were still working that way as indentured servants or whatever you want to call it. That it was in stages. But those houses would have, the Dutch stonemasons really knew what they were doing, and they could do beautiful cellars. So when people describe a cellar as just kind of a rat hole or a cesspool or something, that's not correct, because they were having workshops and so forth down there. So the Kloosterman, Mortensen. Anyway, very interesting topic. Sorry.
If I can make just one quick comment about Peter Lowe. In this letter, Peter Lowe's position on, in case you want to know his position, he's the one who described them as pious Black men. He thought they should be members. That was Peter Lowe's position. in there. In fact, all those objections, he has answers to each one in the letter of why he disagrees with all the other members of the council and consistory who are articulating all this, biological racism. He's countering. Now, what I find interesting then to think about is when I discovered that, because I thought, well, I'm just going to check. And I discovered Peter Lowe claimed Black people as property himself, right? He's clearly not an abolitionist. He's claiming Black people as his own property. But what he is doing, right, it's that moderate Calvinism to say we should be Christian. In fact, I suspect he probably was the one working and converting these Black people. In fact, who knows? It could have been the Black people he claimed as property. He doesn't say in the letter, but he thinks they should be members. And in the end, of course, he's overruled the consistory to know they're not going to be members. Because initially I thought, right, as Lynn is saying, I'm looking for because I know they exist in the Dutch Republic. I'm trying to track out where are the staunch abolitionists in the Dutch Reformed Church, and I'm waiting to find them. So for a moment, I thought, well, maybe it's Peter Lowe, and then I no, it's not Peter Lowe. He's not an abolitionist. That's not what he was pushing. He just wanted these men to become members. He thought they were worthy. That's the word he uses. They're worthy. They're pious. They're worthy. He doesn't send the letter. By the way, when Craig Wilder presented, I was like sitting there like, what are you saying? Craig Wilder has said he thinks he knows who it was. And now this was my theory working in my mind that I suspect he's sending it's going to Albany, and that he's probably sending it to another moderate Calvinist pastor. Craig Wilder thinks it was Reverend Bassett, who is the pastor at the Dutch Reformed Church in Albany. That's who he thinks it was going to. Now, I think that is. My question is, Craig, how did you prove that, though? Like, what's your evidence that that's who it is? But anyway, that's who Craig thinks the letter was going to. It never did get sent. And there's nothing on the letter to say who it was going to.
I'm really sorry. We have gone over our allotted time.
Sorry about
a few minutes. And I know there were other questions that were out there. I'm wondering if some of you who do have questions of Dr. Staggs might just simply engage him for a few moments afterwards. Would that
absolutely
work?
Yeah.
Thank you again. This is kind of a dubious role of serving as coordinator, because you have to be the gatekeeper as well. But nevertheless, thank you for your participation. Thank you, Steve, for just informing us in ways I personally never imagined. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a real pleasure.